from the National Center of Scientific Research in Paris. He will talk about the very important subject of Aristotle and democracy.
Okay. Yeah, I want to thank, my turn to thank the organizer of this conference, which is already an amazing event and which will, I'm sure, be a success. This had to be done this year because most of us couldn't wait 100 years for the next one. And this had to be done here. And then thank you very much. Now, let us turn to science and more specifically to the Aristotelian political science. In his study of constitution, Aristotle considers democracy as a deviant regime, which corresponds to policy. Such a terminological choice is quite important, and I shall come back to this, especially since, according to Aristotle, the right constitutions are prior to the deviant ones, and therefore policy is prior to democracy. Aristotle is not the only one to criticize democracy. Socrates and Plato were also very critical. But if Aristotle shares some of their criticism, it does not accept the main reproach they addressed to democracy, namely that democracy is a bad regime because it gives power, or some power, to people technically incapable of right decision because of their ignorance. In Aristotle's classification of constitution, then, that democracy be a deviant regime means that a legislator cannot consider he has accomplished his task well if the city is dealing with as a democratic regime. This means that democracy does not aim at the common advantage, but is directed towards the satisfaction of the interest of a part of the city, namely the people, demos. This means also that the ruling part of the city does not take into account or doesn't take sufficiently into account the point of view of the other classes, particularly that of the wealthy. A correct constitution, on the other hand, is a constitution which, by its very functioning, spreads virtue within the civic body, making citizens more and more virtuous, and by the same token, more and more happy. In principle, then, a right constitution gives the power to virtuous people. There are three great kinds of right regimes, namely kinship, aristocracy, and policy, and consequently, three great kinds of deviant regime, democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny. Aristotle considers a political world characterized by the confrontation, by two kinds, actually, of confrontations. First, the confrontation between oligarchic and democratic cities, which is punctuated by tyrannic episodes. And second, the confrontation within each city of an oligarchic party and a democratic party struggling for power. Aristotle proposes a unified explanation for the fact that both oligarchy and democracy are deviant constitutions, namely that both the democratic and the oligarchic parties consider absolutely just, and therefore a just basis for the control of the constitution, what is merely just from their own point of view. More precisely, Democrats think that political power should be shared on the basis of free birth, whereas oligarchs think that the distribution of power in the city should be proportional to the wealth of the citizens. Consequently, in oligarchies, the wealthy people who have the power in the city deprive the multitude of the poor of significant political participation, and on the other hand, in democracy, the mass of the poor who control the constitution dispossesses the rich. Deviant constitutions are not immobile reality, but in stable state, full of sound and fury. In fact, two directions are actually open to deviant constitution. I quote politics. Where there is an oligarchy, the aim may be to make the government more oligarchic or less so. Where there's a democracy, the aim may be to make it more democratic or less so. And similarly, in the case of the remaining constitution, the aim may be to tighten or to loosen them, end of quote. As to the tightening of the constitution, in democracy as well as in oligarchy, there is a tendency of the ruling class to monopolize the power. There is an interesting passage in Politics 4:6, in which Aristotle considers different kinds of oligarchies, from the less to the more tightened form. I quote, if property owners are fewer and their properties greater than those mentioned before, the property owners, being more powerful, expect to get more. Hence, they themselves elect from among the rest of the citizens those who are to enter the governing class. But as they are not powerful enough yet to rule without law, they pass a law on this sort. End of quote. That is presumably a law which makes legal the mode of election of the magistrates they like. Aristotle clearly suggests that if they had the power to do so, they would have suspended the laws. But a city which is no longer governed by laws is no longer a political community, but a dynasteia. From this, we may draw two conclusions. The first one is explicitly considered by Aristotle. The last stage of deviant constitution, oligarchy as well as democracy, is tyranny. Tyranny being typically a regime which is not led by laws, but by the desire of the tyrant. The second conclusion is not explicit in Aristotle. If the spontaneous tendency of oligarchy and democracy is to tend towards a form of tyranny, i.e. to depart from political life, if on the other hand, the only obstacle capable of preventing such an exit from political life is that the people in power are not strong enough to govern without laws, then we must conclude that it is a resistance of the ruled class to the hegemonic enterprise of the ruling class which maintains the possibility of a political life for cities and citizens. Presumably, the resistance of the ruled class may be the reason for which a constitution should be loosened. If, for instance, the Democratic Party is in an oligarchy is strong enough, the oligarchs in power have to take the democratic requirements into account and then to loosen the constitution. In Politics 3:8, Aristotle points out a difficulty. Etymologically, oligarchy means domination of the few. What then shall we say about a city in which the majority having the power in the constitution is rich and only few citizens poor? Would it be just to call it a democracy? No, answer Aristotle, because in the very concept of democracy is included the condition that people in charge of the constitution are poor or at least are not rich. Whereas in an oligarchy, it is wealth that gives an access to power. But according to Aristotle and most of Greek philosophers, poor people cannot be virtuous for many reasons that I do not have to consider here. The populace, because of its desire for revenge against the wealthy, but also because of the necessity for the poor to be paid if they want to be full-time members of the assembly, cannot but dispossess the rich. Concerning oligarchy, things seems to be simpler, since the desire to get more and more is characteristic of the oligarchic Weltanschauung. Therefore, if the power is left in the hand of the poor or of the rich alone, this will end in a tyranny. But Aristotle's doctrine concerning the deviant constitution is a balanced one, and this has been insufficiently noticed by commentators. Commentators on Aristotle's politics mainly focus on the critical aspect of Aristotle's judgment, which states that oligarchs are wrong to think that citizenship should depend only on wealth, just as Democrats are wrong to think that any freeborn man should have an equal share of power in the city. That is why, in Aristotle's words, none of them grasp the whole of what is just in the most authoritative sense. But in saying the same sentence that, I quote, all grasp a justice of a sort, but they go only to a certain point, mekri tinos proekondai, Aristotle recognizes that they are partially right. In fact, the Democrats are right to consider freedom and equality the basis for political life, because Aristotle defined political power as, I quote, a kind of power exercised over people who are similar to each other, that is, namely free. But the oligarchs are also right to think that political participation to power should depend on the contribution of each to the welfare of the city, even if they are wrong to consider that the only factor to be taken into account is wealth. We come here to one of the most salient features of Aristotle's political philosophy. Of course, Plato, before him, already had the idea that the legislator may and sometimes must combine some characteristic of different constitutions. But Aristotle's version of this is unprecedented. He considers a combination of democratic and oligarchic traits to be possible in two opposite ways. If the constitution combines the oligarchic greed of gain with the democratic tendency to despoil and oppress wealthy people, the natural tendency of such a constitution will surely lead to a kind of tyranny, regardless of whether oligarch or democrat prevail over each other and are strong enough to impose their own point of view. But if the legislator is wise enough to combine the democratic taste for freedom and the oligarchic idea that power is something which should be merited, this results in a right constitution, more precisely in a polity. But a polity is a right constitution that is an excellent constitution in given circumstances. Yeah. The difference between the right constitution are mainly due to the number of virtuous people. When one man is virtuous, it is just and advantageous to make him a king, whereas when a small number of citizens is virtuous, the city should be governed by an aristocracy. Polity is the excellent constitution adapted to a city with many virtuous citizens. Let me just remind you that this dosage enterprise of the legislator may also combine deviant and right constitution, at least as intermediary stages towards the excellence. It is in such a way that the politics at 5-1, for example, in the politics at 5-1, Aristotle considered, I quote, oligarchic aristocracy and democratically inclined policies. Up to this point, democracy and oligarchy can be described as two sides of the same coin. Both are partially wrong and partially right, and excellence results from the right mixing of their positive sides. But what I want to show now is that even though democracy and oligarchy are equal, one is more equal than the other. We should first be aware that Aristotle is the first political philosopher and maybe the last one. This means, among other things, that a man, according to him, can find his self-fulfillment only as a citizen, and more precisely, as a citizen in a city governed by a right constitution. Such a position is at least curious in a philosopher who was a master of Alexander the Great, the grave digger of political life in Greece. But that's quite another problem. It's quite easy to acknowledge that there is a kind of kinship between politics, understood in the etymological sense, and democracy. This is true in history as well in Aristotle, political philosophy. Now, what about Aristotle's position toward democracy. He obviously shares the common conception of democracy as a political regime par excellence. Indeed, all the other regimes do mix a political orientation and some pre-political aspects. This is obviously the case in kingship, although there is a key difference between an archaic king whose power has religious roots and a political king who submits to laws. Aristocracy and oligarchy have to make a difference between first-class citizens, who in effect have the political power, and a second-class citizen. The popular regime alone makes all free men citizens in a full sense. That Aristotle spontaneously defines political power in as a democratic one may be seen in the remarkable chapter 1 of Book 3 of the Politics. Making a fresh start, this chapter first replaces the original question of the best constitution with that of the city. What is really a city? Ti pote estin a polis, because the constitution is a certain taxis of people living in a city. And second, this chapter elaborates the question of the city in terms of citizen, because a city is a kind of multiplicity of citizens. Then the basic political question the political philosopher has to answer is, who should be called a citizen? That is, what is a citizen? The question of who should be accepted as a citizen is indeed the crucial question of the political philosophy. Aristotle's definition is quite realistic. The citizen is a man who shares in power. I quote, the unqualified citizen is defined by nothing else so much as by his sharing his judgment or decision, that is krisis, and office, arche. End of quote. This obviously goes against the Greek linguistic usage, which used to apply such a definition not to citizen, but to official, magistrate, and politician. In fact, Aristotle says, the assemblymen and the jurors are the real magistrate because they have the real power. And as there is no name to designate people who are both assemblymen and jurors, Aristotle proposes to call them holders of auristos arche, indefinite office. Finally, I quote, the definition that would best fit all called citizen, all people called citizen, is therefore those who participate in indefinite office, end of quote. Then come an often neglected passage. I quote, things which belong to the underlying subject differing in kind, and for which one of these subjects is prior to the other and the other posterior, have nothing or very little in common, end of quote. If we apply this to the topic under consideration, we see that the constitution is the underlying subject of the citizen. But constitution, yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Good. But constitutions differ in kind. Therefore, citizens of different constitutions at the best have little in common, which means, as Newman says, that no definition can be made to suit all the types of the things equally well. This means that holder of an indefinite office, which has been presented by Aristotle as the definition that would best fit all called citizens, is not the definition of any citizen. Many citizens in an oligarchy, for instance, cannot be defined in this way. But Aristotle says, I quote, consequently, the citizen will be different in each constitution. This is why the citizen, as defined earlier, is above all a citizen of a democracy and may possibly be one in other constitutions, but not necessarily, for some constitutions have no demos. Here, I agree with Newman, demos mean popular assembly. Here, Aristotle has recourse to a theoretical schema which is quite frequent in his corpus. This schema includes a series of cognate realities one of which is prior to the other. The remaining entities in the schema relate to the prior entity as imperfect states. Relate to the corresponding perfect state. In ethics, for example, the virtue of women, children, and barbarians are incomplete versions of the virtue of the Greek free adult man. All the possible definitions of citizen, which apply to different constitutions, even though they have little in common, should be considered by reference to the democratic definition. This is why, when considering the non-democratic constitution, Aristotle writes that the assemblyman and the juror are so indefinite offices. But Aristotle presents this definition as a correction, diorthosis, of the basic one. Let me now come back to the relationship between democracy and oligarchy, which I have already claimed to be both right and wrong in some respect. In fact, policy is generally a democracy with some oligarchic characters rather than an oligarchy with a touch of democracy. Of course, the latter case may exist in reality, but we should now see that it is not the case for the most part. I will propose 3 arguments to show that it is so. First, one of Aristotle's more frequent recommendations to the legislator is that the constitution he is organizing should have the majority of the people on its side, or at least not against it. The reason for this is constitutional stability, which is one of the main aims of the legislator. Aristotle is certainly not the conservative thinker some have pretended he was. But Aristotle thinks that to have an ethical effect on the citizens, the constitution needs time. This is why he is ready to accept some imperfect laws provisionally. I quote, "Democracy is more stable and freer from factions than oligarchy. For them, in oligarchy, 2 kinds of faction arise, one among the oligarchs themselves and another against the people. In democracy, on the other hand, the only faction is against the oligarchs, since there is none worth mentioning among the people themselves." Second reason, the extraordinary doctrine developed by Aristotle, especially in Politics 3:11, should be considered once more. According to this amazing chapter, I quote, "The many who are not individually excellent men, nevertheless can, when they have come together, be better than few best people, not individually but collectively." This implies the extremely end of quote. This implies the extremely important conclusion that the multitude possesses a collective phronesis and a collective dianoia which exceed even those of virtuous and intelligent individual. I quote, "Being many, each can have some parts of virtue and more precisely phronesis, and when they come together, the multitude is just like a single human being with many feet, many hands and senses, and so too for their character and their dianoia," end of quote. In the following sentence, Aristotle claims that the judgment of the multitude is better than that of the specialist in the domain of fine arts, a position that we are not ready to accept without difficulty. We should notice that Aristotle, perhaps with some irony, emphasizes that this position is in favor of a popular regime, satisfies the requirements of the oligarch, because the people, when you add the property assessment of the mass of the people, this property assessment is greater than that of the rich. But the sovereignty of the multitude is not unconditional. The people capable of collectively exercising ethical and intellectual virtue must have some preliminary virtue. The idea that a great number of moderately virtuous people can exceed in virtue few very virtuous people presupposes that men of the multitude possess some virtue. The people should then not be too vicious to meet the requirements of collective virtue. But As we have seen, it is ultimately poverty that makes the member of the demos vicious. This is why Aristotle thinks that a good democratic regime, or popular regime rather, should involve people with some revenue. The examination by Aristotle of different kinds of democracy in 4.6 is particularly instructive. From this chapter, it follows that two things may prevent people from having a share in political virtue. First, the need for revenue that make people obsessed with money, and second, the lack of leisure. For a citizen, even if he is also a household manager and should as such be concerned with acquisition of wealth, must not primarily be an economic man. Third and last reason, we should be more precise on the question of the superiority of the multitude over virtuous individuals. There is in Aristotle political analysis an important distinction between general matters which depend on laws and particular cases which depend on decrees. Aristotle's position is that the multitude must be obedient to laws that have not been established by this very multitude. One of the signs that a democracy, has become a demagogic and arbitrary regime is the submission of decree for laws, the substitution, of decree for laws. In extreme democracy, I quote, the multitude has authority, not the laws. This arises when decrees have authority instead of laws. And this happens because of demagogues. For in cities that are under democracy based on law, demagogues do not arise. Instead, the best citizens preside. Where the laws are not in authority, however, demagogues arise, for the people become a monarch, one person composed of many, end of quote. Concerning the popular regime, is advocating, Aristotle adopts completely different position in the case of the law and in the case of decree. In no way does Aristotle accept that the multitude be superior to the laws. The chapter 3:11 is quite clear on this point. As to the question of who should have authority in the city raised earlier, he answered, I quote, nothing is so evident as that the laws, when correctly established, should be in authority, and that the ruler, whether one or many, should have authority over only those matters on which the laws cannot pronounce with precision. Contrary to what a modern citizen might think, deliberation in the Aristotelian city is concerned mainly with the application of laws to particular situations, not with the laws themselves. This can be seen among other texts in the chapter 6.8 of the Nicomachean. I quote, that's my last quotation, political science and prudence are the same state, but their being is not the same. One part of prudence, of phronesis, about the city is the ruling part. This is legislative science. The part concerned with particular is concerned with action and deliberation, since it is concerned with decrees, and the decree is to be acted in a particular form. That is why those people only are said to be politically active, for they are the only ones who practice politics in the way hands craftsmen practice their art, end of quote. But as to the deliberation concerning the application of general laws to particular situations, the arguments of Politics 3:11 fully holds, for it is in the case of this kind of deliberation that we see more clearly that Aristotle has in mind, what Aristotle has in mind when he compares the collective virtue of the multitude with the many who are better judges of the work of arts and poetry. As far as the establishment of the laws is not concerned, this kind of deliberation related to particular cases is in effect better if it is based on the discussion involving many people. In the same way, I quote, a banquet to which many contribute is better. Let me now conclude very quickly. Democracy is definitely a deviation of the policy, and democracy is a deviated policy. And oligarchy is a deviated aristocracy. But policy may, in fact, be considered a kind of democracy, whereas oligarchy is not at all a kind of aristocracy. And this is also because in oligarchies, the criterion for taking part in political power is not virtue, but wealth. To become a policy, then, an oligarchy has to be heavily rectified through the addition of democratic disposition. Quote, in oligarchies, it is beneficial either to select some additional people from the multitude of citizens to serve as official, or to establish a board of officials, and then have the assembly deal only with issues that have been considered by this board. In this way, the people will share in deliberation, but will not be able to abolish something connected with the constitution, end of quote. End of quote. On the contrary, a democracy which is not too much engaged in the way of a tyrannical rule of the multitude is easily enough transformed into a policy by adding some oligarchic feature to the democratic regime in order to prevent the multitude from monopolizing the power. First, the multitude must not be composed of very poor people, but should be composed of mesoi, middle-class people. Second, the deliberation should concern the application of laws to individual situations through decrees, not the laws themselves. This is consistent with two main oligarchic requirements, that citizens are not without revenue and that the people are not master of the laws. In fact, the fact that Aristotle calls the kind of democracy which has incorporated some oligarchic and aristocratic traits of policy, the name common to all constitutions, he says, shows more than anything else that Aristotle's political ideal is fundamentally a democratic one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pellegrin. It was an insightful presentation of Aristotle's ideas of democracy. The program includes so many parts, so I would ask, this is a plenary session, of course, and we can have a discussion. But I will ask if we can have perhaps 2 questions, because it is quite a heavy program, and we have to close this session quite in time. So can we have to accept 2 questions from the audience?
There's one over there.
Microphone. No, please, one moment. Or if you like, you can come here.
So one more time. Hello, my name is Verena Klappstein, University of Passau in Germany. My first question is, did Aristotle think about democracy as a problem of, or about all the different state forms as a problem of legitimization of law? Is that addressed in his works? So that the question of which state form you choose is actually the question of the people who decide, that they legitimize the person who is deciding. Is the question addressed?
If I understood the question, you know what I want to say? Yes? Okay. The question is about the role of the people in the establishment of the laws, in fact, yes. I think on this point, Aristotle is basically a Platonist, because he thinks that the right constitution has to be established by a good legislator, and not at all by the votes of the citizens. And in this case, once it is established, then the citizen has to participate. But in no case does he think that citizen has to be consulted on the establishment of the constitution. He is a Platonist. And in this way, he departs greatly from the modern conception of democracy, of course, because in our democracies, we think that the citizen has to gather and to be consulted on what kind of laws and constitution they want to be involved in. But it's not the case in Aristotle. In this case, in this respect, he is basically a Platonist, which gives power not to the philosopher, but to the legislator, who is the man of the practical excellence.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Accepted. Mr.
The young people.
So, can we have one more question? Do we have? Second question from another person. If somebody is very eager to clarify the notions of democracy in Aristotle, if there is some remark or question, we can have one more, and or we can proceed. Okay, there is one. Thank you very much, and we proceed to the next.